Hello, today I'm going to be reviewing something a little bit different. A play. The very racist titled England People Very Nice by Richard Bean. Highly relevant because at roughly the same time as I'm reviewing this, we're experiencing the backlash from Trump actually basically banning all Muslims, which I didn't think he would do. And I thought everyone's overreacting to Trump being president. He's not actually going to do any of those things. It's going to be incredibly uneventful, but he has. And it's fucking terrifying. Open bracket, I know he didn't technically ban all Muslims, but you know what I mean, close bracket. Much like Trump, this play has been criticised by many for being racist and creating negative stereotypes, and it definitely does. I mean, I'm part Irish, and I was very slightly offended by the whole Irish people only have sex with their siblings thing, which happened in part two, because it's four parts around different times, different kind of types of immigration. There's the French, the Irish, the Jews, and the Bangladeshis. And like Shakespeare, it uses a framing device of not like Shakespeare, an immigration centre performing a play with some very racist directors. However, on the one hand, I would say the stereotypes are so over the top, it's almost a satire on stereotypes rather than actual stereotypes. And on the other hand, the moral issues are a lot more complicated than that. The play is definitely sympathetic towards the immigrants. For example, there's a lot of violent white mobs in every section of the play who chastise the immigrants and even murder one at one point. Spoiler. But it also highlights some hypocrisy of the racist white people, because in every section, apart from the first one, the immigrants in the previous section become assimilated into the culture. In the Irish section, for example, they kind of defend the fact that they're British by saying, this is French housing, go back home. But then in the section before that, they hated all the French people. On the other hand, though, I think it does have some sympathy to the whole UKIP, we want our land back kind of ideology, because it must be quite difficult for certain people who are just as poor as the immigrants, yet they get housing. And I think it's basically says no one is free of this idea if they're in the right situation. For example, in the last section, the protagonist, Mushi, who's a Bangladeshi immigrant, spends 30 years in Britain getting harassed for his origin and denied things like the love of the culture, even though he does get housing. And then towards the end, he sees the Somali wave of immigrants coming in, and they're getting housing and he's not, and then he becomes the new kind of UKIP member, racist type, and said all the Somalis are getting housing and I'm not. So it's definitely a morally complex book, more than it might appear to people who are just hearing about it rather than actually reading/watching it. Regarding the whole humour aspect, I would say it is amusing in parts, but it's not nearly as funny as you would expect from this kind of comedy play, which has been lauded for being incredibly hilarious. A lot of humour is just kind of generic banter between characters, and there's nothing in the dialogue itself that original, even though some of the concepts are more original. Don't go expecting to find it hilarious, although I won't lie, there are some funny bits, but not as funny as everyone says it is. The first section kind of introduces the main formula of the play, because it starts off as kind of really light and bantery and then slowly transforms into very, very dark towards the end, and that is what happens in most of the sections. They all kind of work off a formula which I think is in some way quite good. It shows how repetitive history is, a bit like 100 Years of Solitude, but not as sophisticated as that. And in some ways it does kind of get tedious until the last section, which is a lot more developed, because it takes up the whole of the second act, whereas the first three are just short episodes in the first act. And it develops a lot of these ideas more nuanced. Another good thing I can say about the play, which is the way Richard Bean has covered his tracks, is a lot of its flaws and logic breakages are covered by the immigrant cast in the prologue and epilogue, the framing device. For example, one of the characters gives birth to the twins during 9/11 of someone she first met in the Second World War, and they're basically only about 20 years older in this scenario. I think it's supposed to be, from Richard Bean's point of view, that the time zones are condensed down in a different reality in order to represent the themes better. But the immigrants don't understand this, and I think the fictional people writing the play, the coordinators, the Immigrant Centre, they're not supposed to understand this either, because they're a bit dumb and a bit racist. And to be honest, they're negative stereotypes of white people, so I don't know why everyone's complaining. It's offensive to everybody. Interestingly enough, this play kind of operates on a different level of reality, as I've said before. But possibly the weirdest aspect is the recurring themes of love. It's for Romeo and Juliet, one of the characters says at one point. And the characters actually hear the love music, and they're like, oh, did you hear the love music when we met? Oh no, I didn't. So that's quite strange, but it is also quite a heartening theme of the play, because other than that it's quite nihilistic and preaches that everyone, no matter whether they're an immigrant or a native of a country, will eventually resort to violence because of the circumstances of the situations. But the love stories between several of the characters do work to make the play less depressing and give the viewer more hope for life. Overall, I would recommend the play. It's not nearly as offensive as people think it is. And it's a lot more complex as well than it may be on the surface. It's full of offensive stereotypes of both white people and ethnic minorities, but that doesn't mean it's offensive, because it's satirising offensive stereotypes, as I've already said. But don't let that distract you, because it's very complex and morally challenging. I would designate it with a B, although it's difficult to say because I've never actually seen it performed. So maybe I will change my mind after I've seen probably a clip of it. I doubt I'll ever see it in real life, but hopefully I can find a clip because it's very recent.